My name is Kevin Cade, and I started working for Pods in July this year as the Technology and Development Manager. For this podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Carolyn Spring, who will be talking about her new course, Dealing with Distress, Working with Suicide and Self-Harm. So, Carolyn, what is your experience of suicide?
Hi there. Well, in reality, none at all, because I'm still alive. And, saying that I'm not joking, I'm not being facetious, I'm saying, really, I think it's important that we recognise that what we know about suicide is by its very nature limited, that there may well be a difference between people who go on to kill themselves and those who engage in suicidal feelings and even actions, but don't actually end up dead. In that sense, people like me. So although I've got a long history of suicidality, and I've talked to lots of people, I've done tons of reading and research, I'm just sort of saying that it may be that people who end up killing themselves are in some way different, like qualitatively different from people like me. So, in everything I train on, everything I say, everything you talk about, I know that's my caveat.
Great. So you've got a lot of knowledge about suicide, but I'm interested in your own personal experience. When did you first experience suicidal feelings?
It's a long time ago. Despite how long ago, I still remember it very distinctly, though. It was a Friday afternoon, possibly sort of October, November time. I think I was 15 years old, and it had been... No, it was a couple of months before I went down with chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME as it's also known. So as a teenager, I'd been super sporty, very, very athletic, been involved in absolutely every sport I could. So I used to go out running on a morning, that kind of thing. And then I remember in the January, I went to hockey practice after school as usual, as I did on a Monday. I came home, I fell asleep on the settee before dinner, and I didn't really wake up from that. So not that day, not really for the next 9 months. I was completely bedbound, absolutely exhausted, and in a lot of pain. I could, only get around in a wheelchair because I was just so exhausted. And it was like that for about three years, all through my GCSE year and my A-levels. And so it was a couple of months before that happened that there was this day that was, in many respects, I guess, a kind of a precursor to that. So it was a Friday afternoon. I was in school in an English lesson. For some reason, I remember the weather. It was like threatening rain. So lots of rain clouds, but not yet any rain. And I remember that because that kind of mirrors my mood. And I remember the class as well, because we'd been turfed out of our normal English class, and we were in the physics laboratory for some reason. So it's strange the details you remember. And it was a lesson with my favourite teacher, Miss Barr, my English teacher. But my least favourite aspect of English, which was poetry. And this dark cloud just seemed to be enveloping me. And I felt like I'd fallen down, deep down within myself. Felt utterly, utterly bereft and hopeless and empty and despairing, and I don't know, it's like I just didn't engage in that English lesson at all, and that's very, very unusual for me, because I was a proper geek. I was a model student, because all I could think about in that lesson was how I wanted to die. It's like I got wrapped up in those thoughts and fell down like into a chasm deep within myself.
So then what happened?
I can't remember really. I remember the teacher noticing my black mood and being very concerned about me. And I know what was going on for me at that time of my life. It was the accumulation of nearly 15 years of abuse, and that's what was driving the depression, the hopelessness, and the desire for escape.
So escape seems to be a common theme for suicide.
Yeah, that's right, it is. And I think you can't really understand suicide unless you understand just how trapped you feel. You're in this place of deep, deep pain, and it feels like there's no way out. It feels like you don't have a future. It feels unbearable, absolutely terrible. Like you're in a tiny little prison cell within your own mind, and You're being, as I wrote at one point, you're being tortured to death by your own emotion. That's how I've described it elsewhere. It's just a place of intolerable suffering. So certainly for me, it wasn't about a cry for help. It wasn't attention seeking. I wasn't being melodramatic. That's what we often get accused of. It was just, I guess it was just the unbearability of it all. The sense that you're in so much pain that it's intolerable, that you have to do something about it. It's just that you don't know what. It's like all your options have just closed off. You can't think of any options. And the only option that presents itself to your mind, what your mind gets fixated on, is suicide. And so looking back now, it's very clear that it was a kind of obsessional thinking for me, that my brain got a hold of this idea of suicide as an escape from this intolerable psychic pain, and it just kept on obsessing about it. And there was some kind of comfort in that obsession. It gave me some sense of control, so I could manage the pain while I had the option to kill myself. You see what I mean? That actually thinking about suicide reduced the pain. And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand. They think that if you're thinking about suicide, it's because you've decided to do it. But actually, that's not how I experienced it a lot of the time. I'd think about suicide, the great escape, and it would actually decrease my distress at some level in the short term. It would make it a little bit more unbearable.
So you weren't actually intending to kill yourself. It was more about these obsessive thoughts. Did you see it that way at the time?
No, not really. I mean, that's just me extrapolating backwards at the time, and I can't really explain it, but it's like you're not thinking. Your brain is shut down. I go into the neuroscience behind this on my suicide course, and it's what bears up in my experience too. So, this isn't just a bit of abstract science, but there is a brain science explanation for what it felt like. Because when I was suicidal, I couldn't think of anything else, like literally couldn't. So I guess there's an element of it being a bit of a dissociative experience, because I felt like I was, lost within myself, like I'd fallen down into a big hole. I think it's called a pit of despair for a reason, because there is a real sense of falling down within yourself, being enclosed and the darkness. So the metaphor is a really good description of the visceral experience I had. So to answer your question, when I was thinking suicidal thoughts, I was absolutely serious, because, and to the point really, I was in unbearable emotional pain, and suicide seemed like the only option.
Okay, so I've known you for a while, and I can say that you don't appear suicidal. Is that because it's as simply as having found more options?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a long time now since I've been seriously suicidal. Now, it's not to say, actually, this might surprise people, but it's not to say I don't have suicidal thoughts. I spent so much of my life, from 15 years upwards, obsessing and ruminating on suicide that I think it became a habit. So it's not unusual for me to face a difficult situation and for those thoughts to pop into my head. It's just like a default response. I think the difference nowadays is that I don't fight them, I don't engage with them, I just acknowledge them. I know where they're coming from. I know they're trying to help me. I know that those thoughts are trying to help me find a solution to be rid of the pain. And I also know that I don't want to choose that option, because although it's effective, suicide is extremely effective at ending pain, it's by far the worst option. I think it's key, and you're talking to a suicidal person, that you don't rubbish it as an option, that you don't tell them suicide is not an option, because we know it is. Of course it is. It'll always be an option. Telling someone it isn't an option can increase their distress. There they are. They're in terrible, terrible pain. It's the only option they can think of right now to reduce that pain, and then you tell them that it's not an option. I mean, what effect is that going to have? Surely it's going to increase the distress. In all this pain, there's absolutely no way out. How does that do anything other than increase our sense of helplessness, our sense of hopelessness? So I always found it much more helpful to be told that yes, it's an option, suicide is always an option, but that it's not the only option, and it's by far the worst option. So my recovery really was about discovering those other options, options to reduce my distress. And alongside that, what I really began to learn was that although suicide takes the pain away, it doesn't eradicate it. It just passes it along. So what I mean is, I'm in unbearable pain. I choose suicide as the way of dealing with that, but that doesn't mean that the pain is gone. I've just passed it to everyone around me. And when someone kills themselves, it causes immense suffering. It's caused by suffering, and then it multiplies and causes suffering to other people. And that's why it's the worst option. I think a much better way of reducing the pain of distress is to do it in a way that does actually reduce the pain, rather than just pass it along.
So if you don't want to just pass on your pain, then what are your options? What can you do to reduce it?
Well, obviously, for a long time, I didn't think there was anything you could do. I saw the pain as irremediable. I saw it as this big evil, the big enemy in my life. I saw it as bigger than me. I didn't know the first thing about how to deal with pain. I thought the only way was to kill myself so that I didn't feel the pain anymore. But my recovery, I think, was based on learning that suffering can be resolved. Pain can be reduced. It can be handled. And we can do that in ways that doesn't then cause pain to others. And that seems like a win-win to me. And, alongside that, what's very important, I think, is that we learn to get good at pain. Looking back, I realised that I had a sense of specialness in a way, that a sense of specialness that I didn't deserve to suffer, that I should somehow be exempt from it. Now, I'm not saying that anybody does deserve to suffer, not at all, but suffering's part of the human condition. There isn't a single human being alive who won't suffer, who doesn't suffer, and yet I thought that I should be exempt. I suppose I felt picked on. And it's true, with the extent of the abuse I suffered in childhood, I was indeed picked on. But there's two ways to respond to that. You can take it personally. You can believe that you're abused because of you. You can believe that it's got something to do with who you are, being singled out by the universe. Or you can believe that you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time and you were abused because of your abusers, not because of you. And that was the big shift that had to go on in my thinking. I had to realise that firstly, suffering is a universal human phenomenon. And actually, it's just some people are just better at dealing with it than others. And secondly, I had to realise that I hadn't been singled out personally by the universe for suffering. The only reason I was abused was because my abusers decided to do it. That's it. Now, a lot of the time, we blame ourselves because it gives us a sense of control. And yeah, I totally get that. But the downside is that we then heap up suffering on suffering.
So you said you were picked on. What would you say about your status as a victim in all this?
So it's a subtle distinction, but an important one, that I was victimised, but I didn't have to be a victim. So what I mean is, while I continued to think that I'd been singled out by the universe for suffering, I was kind of positioning myself as a lifelong victim. And I'll tell you what really helped in it, and it's a bit bizarre because it was after one particularly suicide attempt, and my therapist gave me a book to read. It was Viktor Frankl's book. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. It's about the Holocaust. It's about the concentration camp. So it's all about suffering. And you know what happened when I read that book? It's like I stopped thinking that I was the only person in the universe who had ever suffered, and the only person in the universe who was suffering right now. It helped me realise that suffering is part of the human condition. So I realised that I'm not the only one, and it kind of shook me out of my childish self-centeredness about suffering, because it's like I was a child stamping my foot and saying, it's not fair, it's not fair. It's like, no, it's not fair, so what are you going to do about it? As a child stamping my foot, I was expecting the universe to respond and say, oh, okay, you don't like this, well, we'll get it to stop then. Now, obviously, that's not the way it works. Suffering is. So we need to get better at dealing with it, and we need to do something about it. The universe doesn't press a button when we pout and stamp our feet. It doesn't stop it for us. So part of being suicidal for me was this sense that I was the only person in the universe who was suffering or had ever suffered. And so because I'm the only person, I couldn't be expected to learn how to deal with it. So there was this element of kind of petulant revenge in me. Kind of, it's not fair, I'll show you. I'll get my own back by killing myself. Then you'll be sorry. So, yes, I wanted the escape. I wanted the relief from the pain. That was a massive part of it. But I was also, if I'm honest, I was really angry at what had happened to me. And it was kind of like this was how I was going to get even. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and we talk about getting even. The title of your book is Recovery is My Best Revenge. So is there a link there?
Yeah, and that's the journey I had to go on where, really where it's still okay for me to want revenge, but for it to be a good revenge. Killing myself as revenge was just plain stupid. It wasn't going to accomplish anything. Absolutely no revenge in that at all. It's actually just helping my abusers because it would keep them safe. A dead victim can't go to the police. A dead victim can't testify in court. A dead victim can't speak up about what happened to them. A dead victim can't help others to recover. And ultimately, that's not what I wanted. For a long time, I'd been told in various contexts to let it go, to forgive and forget. Like that's easy. But it never sat right with me. It was wrong what happened to me. Really wrong. It was unjust. Of course I wanted revenge. And the more I tried to just stuff that feeling down and ignore it, in many ways, the more vocal it became. It came out in me wanting to kill myself to get even. And so the change for me was realising that I could indeed have revenge by changing the script. Because it's not really a Hollywood blockbuster, is it, to have a script that goes, child is abused, child grows up and kills themselves. Where's the reversal in that? Where's the revenge? Where's the plot twist? There just isn't one. So a better script is child is abused, child grows up, figures out how to recover from that trauma, gets revenge by recovering, and then gets even more revenge by helping others to recover. Suddenly we're cheering because that's a massive plot twist. It's a satisfying end. And a big part of my recovery was recognising that it's like Act 1 had already been written, but I've still got the power over Acts 2 and 3. I can write the script from now on. And this is borne out in the attachment research, that it's not what happens to us that matters as much as how we think about ourselves as a result of what happened to us. So it's not the experience, it's the stance of the self towards that experience. And I found that really empowering. So I didn't need to stay a victim and just let the script play out in the expected way. I could plot twist. I could change what happened in Act 2. I could write a completely different future for myself in Act 3. And that's what I think I've managed to do. If I'd killed myself, the script would have been written for me. It would have been a tragic story. It would have been just devoid of meaning. My abusers would have written my script and nobody would have been inspired by it. But by choosing not to kill myself, by figuring out how to manage pain rather than through suicide, I got to rewrite the script for the rest of my life. And now I hope I'm helping to rewrite the script for other people's lives too. So yeah, that's what I mean by recovery is my best revenge.
So how can you manage pain other than through suicide?
Well, it's a fascinating thing that I found in my researching and which I talk about in my suicide course, that being suicidal offers a temporary reprieve from distress, like I said, by providing the glimmer of hope of a way out, and it can become addictive as a result. But overall, all it does is serve to increase that distress. So the brain science shows that when we're in what researchers call the suicidal mode, we're in the same state as when we're traumatized. It's almost an exact carbon copy of a brain scan. And I was puzzling over why this was. I knew it was relevant, but I didn't quite understand why. And here's what I realised. We go into a traumatic state of mind when we're in a life-threatening situation, right? It's what I teach in various of my other courses about how when we're faced with a threat to our lives or to our physical integrity, the front brain switches off, the back brain lights up, and we shift from daily life mode to danger mode. So We can't think clearly with our front brain, and instead we act on instinct. We go into fight, flight or freeze. It's a very clear sequence of events. And when we threaten to kill ourselves, we're activating that same sequence because it's a threat to our life. So we're effectively traumatizing ourselves. That's distressing, and when we get super distressed, we contemplate suicide as the way out, as the escape, and that starts the cycle all over again. So it's a horrendous, vicious cycle. So instead, we've got to find ways of soothing our distress rather than threatening ourselves all the time, and that's what I go into much more detail on my course on. But the foundation of it is a complete about turn in our approach to dealing with pain. So some of us have been so used to pain and distress all our lives, horrendous abuse, terrible trauma, and we end up thinking that that's the way it has to be. We actually maintain that status quo by continuing to abuse ourselves. And that can be by threatening to kill ourselves too. So after all, if you think about it, if someone turned up at your house every night, and threatened to kill you, that would be traumatic, wouldn't it? It'd be distressing. It's the kind of thing that people seek therapy for, to resolve. And yet that's what we're doing to ourselves every single day. So the trauma of our past is in the past, but we're replicating it ourselves on a daily basis. And that was one of the kind of the breakthrough moments for me to realise that that's what I was doing to myself. And that's why I bang on about self-compassion all the time. That the only way to be free of the effects of abuse is to refuse to continue to abuse ourselves. It's absolutely vital.
So tell me about your suicide course.
I'm really excited about this course, which sounds a bit weird, but we launched it in June 2018. And when I was preparing for it, it was tough for a while. Like, every day you're knee deep in the literature on misery. It just wasn't fun. And after a little while of doing this, reading stuff every single day, I really began to doubt that I actually wanted to do this. It's like, how much misery can you read about without becoming utterly miserable yourself? And then in the midst of all of that, it just suddenly occurred to me that it's like we're getting it the wrong way around. And there's this, it's a microcosm of the world of mental health generally. So we spend all our time looking at the -10, as it were. So mental disorders, trauma, suffering, dysfunction, suicide. And we're maybe trying to get people to move along the spectrum from -10 to -9 and maybe a bit more. And if we work really hard, we might one day get them to 0. And that's what we would then call recovery. But you know what? It's just not what I call recovery at all. So recovery is not about the absence of suicidal thoughts or the absence of disorders. That's not life. Life doesn't consist of just not wanting to kill yourself. Life is full of health and joy and passion and goodness and love and freedom. Life is good, really good. Not just the absence of the bad. It's so much more. And so that was the spark behind this course. So first of all, I wanted to challenge the way that we currently deal with suicide, because it just struck me really over the last several years. It just struck me how unsuccessful it's been. Our focus is just on death rates, which, of course that's important, but I think we're just missing the huge amount of suffering that exists with people who are suicidal but who don't go on to kill themselves. It's like in the DID world, almost everyone I know with DID at some point or another is suicidal. And yet, the vast majority of them are not dead. So for the suicide statistics, it's like they don't count. It's like their suffering doesn't count. And also the main emphasis is on preventing suicide, which, obviously it sounds like a good thing. So what am I saying? That prevention isn't important? Of course it's important, but it's just that I don't see it as the main thing.
So if preventing suicide isn't the main thing, then what is the main thing?
I see the main thing as reducing distress. And the side effect, if you like, of reducing distress is that you also prevent suicide. Whereas our current system is all about locking people up to stop them killing themselves. And yet when we do that, we call it sectioning, we increase their distress. And that distress can then just escalate over time. So our prevention model just sucks, as far as I'm concerned. We're dealing with sticking plasters rather than actually solving the problem. So on my course, I go into that, and I really look at what it takes to move from the -10 of suicide, the -10 of despair, not just to the 0 of not being suicidal anymore, but to the +10 of living a full life, being happy. And that's unimaginable for most people who are suicidal. And there's very good reason for that, because the suicidal mode, like the traumatic state of mind, it shuts down our imagination. So the parts of the brain involved in imagination literally don't fire. We cannot imagine a better future for ourselves. So for me, a big part of this is that we need to get the parts of the brain that are shut down to fire up again. So I do a whole section on that. What does the suicidal mode look like in the brain? What's shut down? How can we get it firing again? Rather than just, I think what's often a fruitless debate with the suicidal person all the time, where we advocate for life and they advocate for death. And it just gets us into this kind of adversarial relationship. And I just don't think it's very effective most of the time.
So the course does actually sound great, even with the title of Suicide. What's the feedback been like for it so far?
Yeah, it's actually been really positive, although, obviously I'm going to say that, aren't I? But something that keeps coming through again and again is people saying, I expected this course to be really hard work, a day on suicide and self-harm, and yet actually it's the most inspiring, uplifting course I've ever been on. And that's really pleasing, because that was intentional on my part. I came out of spending all my time reading about misery and ended up feeling miserable myself, and realised, I guess, that that's not going to help anybody. I didn't want to have a day on misery. We've got to give people reasons for living, not just argue with them that they shouldn't die. We've got to have hope. We've got to have imagination for a better future. And I think that starts with the way that we think about suicide. So we shouldn't feel with dread at the thought of attending a course on suicide. We should be super excited, as I am, at the thought of reversing adversity and leading people from -10 to +10. As far as I'm concerned, it's the most exciting thing. Can you tell I'm quite passionate about that?
Yes, definitely. That's coming through clearly. So when's the course running?
So we've got dates for the autumn on the website, and we've also got them for the spring as well, I think up to Easter at the moment. So over the next few months we're in Nottingham and Bristol in October. We've got Peterborough and London in November. Then at the end of November, beginning of December, I think we're in Manchester. And then lots more dates on the website as well for next year.
So where can someone go online if they wanted to find out all these dates?
So the easiest way is just to go to my website, carolynspring.com, look for the link for live training, and it will take you to a list of everything, and you can book online. You can also book by phone in the office, you can do it over the phone, but by far the easiest way is just to book online.
And who is the course for?
It's for anyone who works with people who are suicidal now, who might be suicidal in the future, so it's relevant to a very, very wide audience. Generally, the majority of people who currently attend my courses are counsellors, are psychotherapists, psychologists, and so on. But this course in particular is relevant to a far wider group of professionals than that. Trauma survivors themselves, they're welcome to come, as long as they realise this isn't a kind of suicide recovery group or anything like that. It's me teaching all day. There's optional buzz groups as we go through the day. But the overall setting for it is professional CPD. So as long as people are happy to engage on those terms, literally everyone's welcome. So we've had folks from mental health teams, police, probation, education, adoption and fostering, hospices, all sorts of people. I try to make my content applicable to a wide range of people.
That sounds great. I'm looking forward to being there myself. And I just say I know that plenty of other people will be benefiting from this. So thanks a lot for the research you did, for digging into such a dark subject and finding some light that I know is going to be helpful to lots of people. Yeah,
thanks very much. I'm really looking forward to it myself as well.
Great. So thanks everyone for joining us for this, our first Carolyn Spring podcast. Where you found this, you'll be able to find more. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, goodbye.
Bye.